My son didn't know I owned the law firm his wife just made partner at, and when she said, "Get this embarrassment out of my house before the Hendersons see her," I left quietly, then walked into her promotion review a week later. The chair at the head of the table was mine. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the look on Camille's face when she finally understood what she had done. Not the managing partner's voice going quiet in a way that made the whole room hold still. Not even Geraldine, who has known me for 27 years and has the poker face of a federal judge, letting the faintest trace of something satisfied cross her mouth as she slid the third folder across the mahogany. The chair. They had placed it there before Camille arrived. Someone had thought to remove the standard nameplate and leave the head of the table simply, quietly empty. The way you leave a seat for someone who is going to walk through the door. I am 71 years old. I drive a 2009 Buick LaCrosse the color of old pewter. I have a kitchen clock that my husband Roy hung on the wall in 1989 and which has not been accurate since 2004, and which I have never replaced because I like that it's wrong in exactly the same way every day. I wear sensible shoes. I have what Camille once described, at a dinner party I was not supposed to hear, as a certain homey quality. She meant small. She meant safe to dismiss. She had no idea who I was. And the night she looked me in the eye and told my son to remove me from her kitchen like I was a smudge on her marble counter, she made the worst mistake of a life that had, up to that point, been very carefully constructed to avoid mistakes. I need to back up. This story does not make sense without Roy. Roy Henderson. Not the Henderson from the party, different man entirely, just one of those coincidences that would make a novelist nervous. Roy died 11 years ago, March 4th, a Tuesday, which has always seemed wrong to me. Tuesday is not a dramatic enough day to lose the person you built your entire life beside. Roy deserved a Saturday. He deserved a sunrise. What Roy left me, beyond the clock and the Buick and the kitchen I have cooked in for 40 years, was money, significant money. Roy was not a flashy man. He wore the same style of wool crewneck from October to April and thought restaurants that didn't post the prices were exercising a kind of moral weakness. But Roy had spent 30 years building commercial properties in 3 counties, and when he died, he left me a portfolio that most people would look at and assume belonged to a corporation, which is, in part, because it does. Roy was meticulous about asset protection. He had a saying, never let your right hand see what your left hand is doing, especially if your right hand is the government. Everything of consequence ran through trusts and LLCs and holding structures that were technically legal, thoroughly invisible, and curated for 2 decades by Geraldine Okafor, JD, founding partner of Okafor Financial Law Group and the most frighteningly competent woman I have ever been friends with. Geraldine and I met at a school board meeting in 1996 when we were both arguing against the same budget proposal and realized approximately 3 minutes in that we were more useful as allies. She has been my attorney, my occasional co-conspirator, and my most reliable dinner companion since Roy died. She also happens to have structured the original investment vehicle through which I became a co-founding stakeholder in Caldwell Marsh and Lee, attorneys at law, the firm where my daughter-in-law Camille had just 9 days before the party been made partner. I did not tell Theo about the investment. I had my reasons, and they were good ones. Money changes families. I had watched it happen to Roy's brother. Watched a modest inheritance turn 2 grown men into attorneys themselves, just pointed at each other. I had watched it hollow out friendships I valued. Watched people I liked become people who calculated. When Theo started dating Camille and it became clear the relationship was serious, I made a deliberate choice to let him build his life without the shadow of my portfolio. I wanted him to be his own man. I wanted a daughter-in-law who chose me, not what I might one day sign over. I had also watched Camille closely enough in those early years to notice how she related to money. Not her own, she was disciplined about her own, but other people's. There was a specific alertness she had around anyone she suspected of having more than they appeared to. I had watched her recalibrate in real time when she learned the background of a party guest. I had watched her file things away. I kept my files away from her line of sight. I thought it was a temporary precaution. I told myself I would find the right time, the right moment, some comfortable settling of the relationship when the question of resources would be background rather than foreground. I waited for Camille to choose me. She chose otherwise. I waited for Camille to choose me. She chose otherwise. They met at a bar association mixer 8 years ago. Theo is a civil engineer. He was there with a college friend who just passed the bar. Camille was a 3rd-year associate at Caldwell Marsh, already the kind of polished that takes effort to maintain. I met her 6 weeks later over brunch at a restaurant she chose, and I will say this. In those early years, she was good at performing warmth. She remembered that I liked black tea. She asked follow-up questions about things I had mentioned months prior. The performance started slipping around year 3. Small things first. The way she'd steer Theo away from Sunday dinners when something more promising came up socially. The way she began referring to my neighborhood as your side of town with a particular inflection. The way she absorbed and redirected my stories. I would begin telling something. She would interrupt with, "Oh, that reminds me." And by the time the anecdote circled back around, it was hers. I told myself it was anxiety. I told myself she was ambitious in the way young women have to be to survive certain rooms, and that sometimes the edges of that sharpened in uncomfortable directions. Theo Theo said she just needed time to warm up. Theo has always believed people will warm up if you give them enough time. This is one of his most beautiful qualities and one of his most costly ones. The party was a Saturday in October. The firm throws a celebratory dinner for new partners. It is a whole production, catered, good wine, the kind of event where people laugh at things that aren't quite funny because the stakes of the room demand performance. Theo had asked me 3 times if I was sure I wanted to come. I told him yes each time without explaining why. I brought my grandmother's cassoulet in a Pyrex dish that has been in my family longer than Theo has been alive. Camille met me at the door in a navy suit, and the expression of someone who has mentally rehearsed this interaction and is now executing it on a 5-second delay. Hazel, kiss on the cheek, close enough to be technically present, far enough to communicate nothing. So glad you could make it. Stay near the kitchen tonight, she added quietly, almost as an aside as I stepped inside. These people are important. I said nothing. I smiled. I had been smiling and stepping past Camille for 3 years by then. You develop a rhythm. The house was beautiful in the anxious way of houses decorated to be photographed rather than lived in. Everything was cream and gray and the specific shade of brass that gets featured in shelter magazines. The flowers were white. The caterers were in matching aprons. The kitchen island was 8 feet of veined marble that had probably cost more than my car. Theo was at that island when I came in, focused on a bottle of Barolo with more intensity than it required. He looked tired. He had been looking tired since summer, and I had been watching it and not saying anything and waiting for him to come to me, which is what I do, because that is what Roy did, and it was always right. Mom, he hugged me properly, which he always does. You didn't have to bring anything. I know, I said, and set the cassoulet on the counter. The Hendersons arrived 40 minutes later. Douglas Henderson is the kind of man who gets introduced at dinner parties by what he advises rather than what he is. Doug consults for several Fortune 500 boards, and his wife Margaret is the kind of woman whose silences land like statements. They are in their mid-60s, silver-haired, and carry the specific ease of people who have not had to prove themselves in many years. Camille went after them like a heat-seeking system. She laughed at Douglas's jokes a half-beat before the punchline arrived. She touched Margaret's arm twice in the first 20 minutes, which is once too many. She refilled their champagne herself even though there were caterers paid specifically to do that, and the caterers kept looking at each other with the professional blankness of people maintaining plausible deniability. I watched from the kitchen end and ate a small piece of cheese and felt a feeling I have learned to recognize as patience finding its form. Then the caterer asked about the cassoulet. He was a young man, maybe 25, with the earnest manner of someone who actually cares about food. He'd lifted the lid to check the temperature, and his face changed. Did someone make this? He asked, of no one in particular. This smells incredible. Camille was on the other side of the island. She spun around fast enough that champagne sloshed in the glass she was holding, and the look on her face cycled through 4 things in under 2 seconds. Recognition, irritation, calculation, smile. Oh, that's just something Hazel brought, she said. The word just landed where she put it. The caterer looked at me with genuine interest. What is it? Cassoulet, I started. My grandmother's recipe, actually. She was from Lyon. She has a lot of these old-fashioned dishes. Camille's voice was bright and social and aimed at Margaret Henderson like a spotlight. A little laugh. Hazel is very traditional. Not the words. The words were fine. It was the ownership in them. The way she placed me on a shelf and patted the shelf and moved on. Like I was a decorative object she'd acquired through Theo and was now curating for the entertainment of more important guests. Margaret Henderson did not laugh. She looked at Camille. Then she looked at me. Then she said, Lyon. Roy and I were there in 2018. The Bouchons are extraordinary. What neighborhood was your grandmother from? I told her. We talked for 11 minutes about the city of Lyon, about the particular character of the 4th arrondissement, about a pastry neither of us could remember the name of that. We were both nevertheless certain tasted like a specific combination of butter and nostalgia. Douglas Henderson stopped consulting his phone. The caterer stayed where he was and listened. Camille stood very still for those 11 minutes. I felt Theo somewhere in my peripheral vision, felt him watching. Then he said something to his wife. I was focused on Margaret and didn't hear it. Something quiet, but I saw Camille's face split open. She looked at the Hendersons. She looked at me. She looked at Theo. And then, because cruelty always mistakes itself for power, because performance anxiety and champagne and a marriage going wrong in ways she was not willing to name will do specific things to a person's judgment, she said it, loud enough for the whole kitchen to hear. Theo, please get this embarrassment out of my house before the Hendersons see her. There was shame first. The shame of a man who has watched this coming for 2 years and told himself it wouldn't arrive. Then anger. Specific and late, then something I can only describe as fracture, the kind of thing that happens when you've hurt both of the women you love and you can't figure out which direction to move. I set my water glass down. The sound the glass made on the marble was the only sound in the room. Could you point me to the door, dear? Camille blinked. She had been expecting tears, I think, or a trembling protest, something that would give her the high ground, something she could use later in the retelling. She made such a scene. You have no idea. Something she could weaponize in the days following to make herself the reasonable one. She had not been expecting calm. Calm destroys people who run on noise. I touched Theo's arm. Take care of your wife. Then I walked out. I sat in my car for 4 minutes. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I did not cry because I was not sad. I was something older than sad and more deliberate. The particular feeling of a woman who has been patient for a long time and has just been handed, publicly, a reason to stop. I drove home, made tea, did not drink it. At 9 o'clock, I called Geraldine. She answered on the second ring, which is how I know she had been expecting my call. Geraldine answers first-time callers on the third ring and close friends on the second, and I have been in the second ring category for 24 years. How bad? She said. I told her. A long pause. Then, what do you need? I need the Lakeshore Glen file, I said. The Dale Hewitt file, and the deed on Chesterton. Another pause. Geraldine is not a woman who uses silence accidentally. What kind of changes are we making, Hazel? I looked at my untouched tea, steam rising, the kitchen clock saying 8:44 when it was actually 9:07. The clarifying kind, I said. Here is what Camille did not know. Here is what even Theo did not fully know, because I had made choices about what to share and what to hold, and those choices had seemed right at the time, and, as it turns out, were going to prove more consequential than I had anticipated when I made them. What kind of changes are we making, Hazel? I looked at my untouched tea, steam rising, the kitchen clock saying 8:44 when it was actually 9:07. The clarifying kind, I said. Here is what Camille did not know. Here is what even Theo did not fully know, because I had made choices about what to share and what to hold, and those choices had seemed right at the time, and, as it turns out, were going to prove more consequential than I had anticipated when I made them. Caldwell, Marsh, and Lee was founded in 2006 by 3 attorneys with excellent credentials and a working capital problem. Lawrence Caldwell had clerked for a federal judge. Patricia Marsh had built a reputation in employment law that made corporations nervous. James Lee had the kind of client list that doesn't get discussed at dinner parties. They had the talent, the reputation, and the vision. What they needed was a building, my building, the Chesterton property, a 9-story commercial space in the financial district, renovated 2004-2005. Roy's last major project before his health began its slow decline, had been sitting at 60% occupancy when the Caldwell partners came to me through a mutual connection in 2006. They needed long-term office space at favorable terms while they built their client base. I needed an anchor tenant who would stay. We negotiated for 6 weeks. The final arrangement, structured by Geraldine with the meticulous care she applies to everything, was not a simple lease. It was a preferred equity stake, a revenue participation agreement, ownership structure buried in a holding company called Lakeshore Glen Properties, LLC, which held the deed, which sat in a trust called the Dale Hewitt Trust, named for Roy's middle name and his mother's maiden name, which was the way he liked to honor the people he loved. I was the beneficial owner of approximately 22% of the building that housed Caldwell, Marsh, and Lee. The firm paid me rent every month. The firm's growth had increased the value of that equity. When they expanded to the 32nd floor in 2019, the floor where Camille now kept her office, the floor where partners gathered for important meetings, it had been my capital, reorganized through a secondary investment vehicle Geraldine and Lawrence Caldwell had structured together that helped fund the build-out. Camille had been at the firm for 6 years. She had made partner 9 days before that Saturday party. She had never thought to trace who owned the building. She had never thought to trace why the lease terms were unusually favorable. She had never asked Theo what his mother had done with Roy's estate. She had seen an old woman with a Pyrex dish and a Buick and made her calculations. Those calculations were about to be corrected. The following Monday, Geraldine called Lawrence Caldwell. I want to be precise about what happened and what did not happen. I did not ask Geraldine to fire Camille. I did not ask anyone to destroy her career or damage her professional standing in ways she had not earned herself. I am not a vindictive woman. I am a clarifying one. What I asked was that the ownership structure be made transparent to the firm's current leadership in an official capacity, via documentation rather than conversation. What I asked was that the Dale Hewitt Trust be moved from passive to active status with respect to its seat on the building's advisory board, a seat that had technically existed since 2006 and had simply, quietly, never been exercised. What I asked was that the review of Camille's partnership be handled in a standard and proper way, which included all stakeholders being present. That's all. Lawrence Caldwell, who is a careful man with an excellent memory, listened to Geraldine for 22 minutes. Then he said, "I'll make the arrangements." There was also the matter of Margaret Henderson. I did not call her. I want to be clear about that too. Margaret Henderson is a woman who makes her own decisions and draws her own conclusions. And she had been in that kitchen and she had functioning eyes and ears. If she wrote a note to the managing partner of a firm where her husband sat on an advisory committee, that was her choice. freely made, based on what she had witnessed herself. Geraldine mentioned to me later that the note was brief and specific. She did not show it to me. I did not ask to see it. The following Friday, I wore my navy cardigan, my old pearls, the real ones Roy gave me for our 20th anniversary that Camille had once described as sweet, in a tone that meant dated, my plain black shoes. I signed into the lobby at 8:52 a.m. Martin, the lobby security guard who has known me for 11 years because I sometimes bring him cassoulet, nodded with the professional neutrality of a man who has been briefed about today and has chosen wisdom. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," he said. "Good morning, Martin," I said. "How's your daughter?" "Starting kindergarten Monday," he said. "She'll love it," I said. And then I went to the elevator. The 32nd floor conference room is the large one at the north end of the hall. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A mahogany table that seats 14. Good acoustics, which matters more than people think when you're having conversations that need to land. I arrived at 5 minutes to 9. Camille was already there. Navy suit. Not the same one from Saturday. A different navy suit. She has several, I had noticed over the years. A rotation of armor. With her hair pulled back and her hands folded on the table in front of her, with the careful stillness of someone who has practiced keeping them still. She had a legal pad, a pen, the small leather portfolio she carried to every important meeting. She looked up when I walked in. The expression on her face went through 5 things very quickly. Surprise, recalibration, the performance of poise, confusion, and then something else. Something I had not seen in 6 years of dinners and holidays and carefully managed family occasions. Something genuine, concern. She watched me walk to the chair at the head of the table. That was when she understood that the room had been arranged before she arrived. Lawrence Caldwell, managing partner, 22 years at the firm, the kind of man who wears the same style of suit in 3 different colors and considers variety handled, was to the left. Patricia Marsh, still formidable at 68, founding partner and head of employment, sat across from him. 2 senior partners I recognized from firm events sat further down. Geraldine was near the wall on a chair slightly removed from the table, the position of an attorney present in an advisory capacity, which is the exact position from which she has operated for 27 years when she wants to be in the room but not appear to be in the room. One chair had been left empty at the head. I sat in it. Geraldine slid the first file across the table. The Lakeshore Glen file, the original holding company documents, the founding operating agreement, the signature pages going back to 2006. She slid it softly. The sound it made on the mahogany was quiet and final. Then the Dale Hewitt file, secondary investment structure, 2019 capital contribution. My name, distributed across 3 corporate layers but traceable, quite clearly, by anyone reading carefully. The kind of document that looks unremarkable until you follow it all the way through, at which point it becomes very remarkable indeed. Then the Chesterton deed, the property itself, the anchor of the whole arrangement, plain language, the beneficial owner of record spelled out with the clarity that Geraldine brings to everything she prepares. She had told me once that the purpose of good legal documentation is to be undeniable, even to someone who very much wants to deny it. Each folder landed like a clock ticking down. Camille stared at them. I watched her eyes move across the labels in the way of someone doing rapid math. Her pen cap was between her fingers. I watched her bend it without seeming to realize she was doing it. Lawrence cleared his throat. "Before we begin," he said, "there's the matter of Mrs. Henderson's note." The pen cap snapped. "Mrs. Henderson misunderstood the situation," Camille said. Her voice was very controlled. She had deployed that control before in rooms like this. I had seen her in professional mode, had always acknowledged privately that she was good at it. She was not as good at it today. Nobody at the table moved. Lawrence tilted his head in the way of a man who has heard many things described as misunderstandings and has developed precise opinions on the taxonomy. "Did she?" he said. Camille looked at me. It was the first time in 6 years of knowing each other that she looked at me directly, without agenda, without performance, without the social calculus she brought to every interaction. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you are trying to understand how badly you miscalculated, and realizing the answer is very. The woman she had pointed at the door was the reason she had a door to point from, not just the building. The lease terms that had made the firm viable in its first years. The capital that had built out the floor she worked on. The ownership structure that had, in part, underwritten the growth that had made her partnership possible. Not entirely, not solely. Camille is a talented attorney, and her work is genuinely good, and I have never disputed that, but partially, meaningfully, in the way that foundations are partial and meaningful. She had never looked down. Patricia Marsh, who has spent 30 years in employment law and who does not make small talk, uncapped her own pen and set it on the yellow legal pad in front of her. "Camille," Lawrence said, "we need to talk about your future here. Not because I don't know. I know most of it through Geraldine, who tells me what I have a right to know and nothing more, which is what I want from her. But because the specifics belong to a legal process that is still in motion, and because some portion of what happened in that room involved Theo, and what involves Theo is not entirely my story to tell, I will tell you what mattered." Camille's partnership was placed under a formal 30-day performance review. The review was standard procedure, the kind of thing the firm initiates when new information surfaces about a partner's professional conduct, and the information that had surfaced, via Margaret Henderson's note and via the suddenly active stakeholder at the head of the table, was specific enough to require it. The firm did not fire her on the spot. That is not how firms like this work, and it is not what I wanted. What I wanted was accountability with process. What I wanted was for Camille to sit in a room and understand, clearly and on the record, that the woman she had dismissed had been, all along, a person whose respect she should have cultivated. What I wanted, if I am being completely honest, was for her to know, just to know. Geraldine told me later that Camille was quiet for most of the meeting, that she answered the questions she was asked, that she did not, to her credit, try to relitigate what had happened at the party, or claim that I had misrepresented it, or perform any of the strategies that lesser people deploy when they've been caught in their worst moment. She just sat there and understood. Theo called me that night at 7 o'clock. I let it ring once. Then I answered. Mom. His voice had the specific texture of someone who has been crying and stopped and will start again as soon as he lets himself. Hi, honey. You could have told me. I know, I said. Why didn't you? I thought about it. I thought about Roy and what money does to people and what I had wanted Theo's life to look like, built on himself, on his own 2 feet, on the choices he made rather than the resources he'd been handed. Because I wanted you to be yours, I said. Not mine. A long silence. The kind that costs something. She said she didn't know, he said finally. She didn't, I said. She also didn't ask. Another silence. Are you okay? He asked, which is the question he'd been not asking since the party. Yes, I said, and meant it. Are you? He didn't answer that one right away. I don't know what's going to happen, he said. You don't have to know tonight, I said. Come for dinner Sunday. I'll make the cassoulet. Camille's partnership review resulted in a formal reprimand and a 12-month probationary period. She retained her position. She is, by all accounts, working very hard. Geraldine says the firm has noted the improvement. Margaret Henderson sent me a note. Handwritten, 3 sentences, the kind of note that only means something because it wasn't required. I sent her back the cassoulet recipe. Theo comes for dinner most Sundays now. He and Camille are in couples counseling, which I know because he told me, not because I asked. I do not ask him questions about his marriage. I cook, and I listen to what he offers, and I let him be the one to decide how much to say. I still drive the Buick. I still wear the sensible shoes. The kitchen clock still says 8:44 when it's 9:07. Roy hung it there in 1989. He measured the wall 3 times before he put the nail in. He wanted to make sure it was level. He was the kind of man who did things right the first time and lived with the results, and I think about that sometimes. The patience of a person who takes their time and trusts the outcome. Camille made one mistake. She looked at my life and decided what it meant without looking at what it was built on. People do that. They see the surface and they think they see everything. They don't know about the foundations. They never think to check the foundations. The week after the conference room, I had coffee with Geraldine. We went to the place we always go, a small Turkish cafe 3 blocks from her office where they know her order and bring it before she sits down. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at me over the rim. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it. Roy used to say that the worst thing you can do to a person is underestimate them, I said. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it. Roy used to say that the worst thing you can do to a person is underestimate them, I said. He said it was worse than cruelty because at least cruelty acknowledges the person exists. Geraldine nodded. I don't feel triumphant, I said. I feel clarified. She smiled. The real one, not the professional one. That sounds like you, she said. I drank my coffee. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do in October, moving and changing and not particularly caring about any one story among the thousands it was holding at once. People with foundations they'd built, and people who hadn't bothered to look, and people learning, too late or just in time, which one they were. I thought about Theo eating Sunday dinner. I thought about Camille at her desk, working harder than she had ever worked in her life, and whether that was enough, and whether it would be, and whether what remained between them could be rebuilt or only replaced. I thought about Roy's clock, wrong in exactly the same way every day, which you can call a flaw, and some people do. Or you can call it reliable, consistent, a thing that has never surprised you. I know what time it really is. I always have.